The spring of 1945 arrived cold and merciless across the German countryside. Greta Zimmermann pressed her back against the crumbling brick wall of what had once been a munitions factory, her breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. At 23, she had already lived several lifetimes, each one harder than the last. Her fingers, raw and bleeding from weeks of forced labor, clutched a stolen turnip she'd managed to hide in her coat pocket. Around her, dozens of other women huddled together for warmth, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes reflecting a peculiar mixture of terror and relief. The thunder of American artillery had been growing steadily closer for 3 days now. The war was ending. Everyone knew it, but knowing and surviving were two different things. "They're coming," whispered Ilse, a former schoolteacher from Munich whose elegant hands now bore the same scars as Greta's. "I can hear their trucks." Greta nodded but said nothing. What was there to say? They had all heard the stories, whispered in barracks, passed from camp to camp, each tale more horrifying than the last. What the Russian soldiers did to German women. What revenge looked like when years of hatred finally found its target. The Americans would be no different, they'd been told. Why would they be? She thought of her younger sister, Anna, dead from typhus 6 months ago in the work camp at Ravensburg. She thought of her mother, disappeared into the chaos of Berlin's final days. She thought of her father, who had never come home from Stalingrad. The war had devoured her entire family, and now it was finally coming to devour her. The factory's main gate groaned open with a metallic shriek that made every woman flinch. "Do not resist," someone called out in German, the accent unmistakably American. "You are now prisoners of the United States Army. You will not be harmed if you cooperate." Laughter, bitter and hollow, rippled through the group of women. Promises meant nothing anymore. They had heard too many promises, believed too many lies. Greta stood slowly, her legs trembling from exhaustion and malnutrition. Through the morning mist, she could see them, American soldiers in uniforms that seemed impossibly clean, carrying weapons, but not pointing them. One soldier, younger than Greta herself, stood near the gate with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it pity? Disgust? Anger? The women were herded into the factory courtyard, about 200 of them in total. Some were Wehrmacht auxiliaries, young women who had served as radio operators or clerks. Others, like Greta, were simply civilians who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the Reich's desperate final conscriptions swept through what remained of German territory. A few wore the tattered remains of SS auxiliary uniforms, their insignias hastily torn away. They stood in ragged lines, shivering in the April morning, waiting for whatever came next. The Americans set up their processing station with an efficiency that would have impressed even the most rigid German military officer. Long tables appeared, manned by soldiers with clipboards and translators. One by one, the women were called forward to provide their names, ages, hometowns, and service records. Greta watched as Margarethe, a sturdy farm girl from Bavaria, approached the table. She was crying, not from fear, Greta realized, but from exhaustion. The American soldier processing her looked up, said something in English to his companion, then called over a medic. "She's dehydrated." The translator explained to Margarethe in careful German, "You need to sit down before you fall down." They gave her water, real, clean water from a canteen. Margarethe drank like she'd forgotten how, and 2 other women rushed forward to catch her when her knees buckled. "Easy now," the American medic said, his German broken but understandable. "Slow. Small sips." When Greta's turn came, she walked to the table with her spine straight and her chin up. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid, even though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The officer behind the table was older than most of the soldiers, perhaps 40, with tired eyes and silver threading through his dark hair. His nameplate read Captain Morrison. "Name?" he asked through the translator. "Greta Zimmermann." "Age?" 23. "Occupation before the war?" "I was studying to be a nurse at the university in Heidelberg." Captain Morrison looked up from his paperwork, meeting her eyes for the first time. Something in his expression shifted, not to cruelty, but to something Greta hadn't expected. Recognition, perhaps. as if he suddenly saw her as a person rather than an enemy. "A nurse," he repeated in English, then said something to the translator. "The captain wants to know why you stopped," the translator said. "The university was bombed. Then they conscripted everyone who could work. I spent 2 years in the munitions factory." More writing. More questions. Where was her family? Were they Nazi Party members? Had she participated in any war crimes? To that last question, Greta almost laughed. War crimes. As if someone with her hands could have committed crimes against anyone. She had been a victim of this war, just like everyone else, swept along in its terrible current, trying desperately not to drown. "No," she said simply. "I assembled artillery shells. I did what I was told so they wouldn't shoot me." Captain Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Next," he said, but not unkindly. The makeshift POW camp was nothing like what Greta had imagined. The Americans had commandeered a large textile factory on the outskirts of town, its machinery removed to make room for rows of cots. Real cots, with blankets. The building had running water. There were latrines that actually flushed. But it was still a prison. Guards stood at every exit. High fences topped with barbed wire surrounded the compound. The women were searched thoroughly before being allowed into the dormitory areas, their meager possessions catalogued and examined. That first day passed in a haze of confusion and exhaustion. The women were too tired, too overwhelmed to do much more than claim their cots and collapse. Greta lay on her assigned bed, an actual mattress, thin but clean, and stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. Around her, other women whispered nervously. "When do you think they'll start?" asked Frida, a hollow-eyed woman in her 30s, who had been assigned the cot next to Greta's. "Start what?" "The interrogations. Whatever they're going to do to us." Greta had no answer. She pulled her threadbare blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, though sleep seemed impossible. But somehow, impossibly, she slept. She was awakened by shouting. Greta jerked upright, her heart racing, instinctively looking for somewhere to hide. Around her, other women were doing the same, scrambling from their cots, backing against walls, preparing for the worst. American soldiers had entered the dormitory, but they weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying trays. "Everyone up!" The translator called out in German. "Line formation for morning meal." Meal. The word seemed foreign, almost meaningless. In the work camps, they had received a daily ration of watery soup and a small piece of bread. That was a meal. What could these Americans possibly mean? The women formed uncertain lines, shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously. The soldiers set up folding tables at one end of the dormitory, and the smell that wafted from the containers they carried made Greta's stomach clench painfully. Real food. Actual real food. One at a time. The translator instructed. "You will receive a tray with your meal. Take it to your cot to eat. There is enough for everyone." Greta shuffled forward in line, not quite believing what she was seeing. When her turn came, an American soldier, a young private with red hair and freckles, handed her a metal tray. On it sat a bowl of oatmeal, thick and steaming. 2 slices of bread with butter, Real butter, not the ersatz margarine they'd been eating for years. A spoonful of jam. And most incredibly, a cup of something white and steaming. Greta stared at it, uncomprehending. "Milk," the translator said, noticing her confusion. "Warm milk. The captain ordered it specially. He said you all looked half-frozen." Warm milk. Greta's hands shook as she carried the tray back to her cot. She sat down carefully, as if any sudden movement might make this mirage disappear. Around her, other women were receiving the same trays, the same looks of disbelief on their faces. She picked up the cup of milk first, holding it between her palms, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. The steam rose in delicate tendrils, carrying a smell she'd almost forgotten, rich, sweet, clean. She raised the cup to her lips and took a sip. It was perfect. Not too hot, not too cool. Sweet and nourishing and impossibly gentle on her ravaged throat. Greta closed her eyes and took another sip, then another, and suddenly she was crying. Great, heaving sobs that she couldn't control. Couldn't stop. Didn't want to stop. Around her, the same thing was happening. Women were crying into their warm milk, clutching their trays like precious treasures, weeping for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just the food, though God knew they were starving. It wasn't just the warmth, though they had been cold for so long. It was the kindness. These men, their enemies, their captors, had given them warm milk, not cold rations thrown at them like they were animals, not punishment or revenge or cruelty, just warm milk, offered with a simple recognition that they were cold and hungry and human. Ilsa, the former schoolteacher, sat on the next cot over, tears streaming down her face as she ate her oatmeal with shaking hands. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would they?" "Maybe," Greta said softly, wiping her own tears away. "Maybe not everyone wants revenge." The warm milk became routine. Every morning, the same meal arrived: oatmeal, bread, and warm milk. The women stopped flinching when the soldiers entered. Some even began to say "danke," thank you, as they received their trays. But it wasn't just the food that changed. On the third day, Captain Morrison arranged for the camp to receive medical care. A team of Army doctors and medics set up a clinic in one of the factory's offices, and every woman was given a basic examination. Greta watched as the medics treated infected wounds, provided medicine for fevers and dysentery, even set broken bones that had healed incorrectly. They worked with professional detachment, but also with care. When one medic had to lance an infected abscess on Margarethi's arm, he held her hand and told her, through the translator, that she was very brave. On the fifth day, packages arrived from the Red Cross. Each woman received a bundle containing soap, a comb, a toothbrush, sanitary supplies, and clean undergarments. Such small things, but they represented something enormous: dignity, the recognition that they were not just prisoners, but people. The Americans also set up work details, but not the brutal forced labor the women had endured under their own government. Those who were healthy enough could volunteer to help with laundry, food preparation, or cleaning. In return, they received extra rations and small comforts: chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper. Greta volunteered for the medical clinic. Her nursing training, interrupted though it had been, came flooding back. She helped the medics with basic care, translating medical terms between German and English, comforting frightened women during examinations. One afternoon, as she was helping to bandage a young woman's leg, Captain Morrison appeared in the clinic doorway. "Miss Zimmermann," he said through the translator. "May I speak with you?" Greta's heart raced, but she nodded and followed him to a quiet corner of the room. "I've been reviewing your file," he said. "You were in university, studying nursing." "Yes, sir. We're short on medical personnel. Would you be willing to receive additional training? Work more extensively in the clinic?" Greta stared at him. "You want me to work as a nurse? For the American Army?" "As a volunteer medical assistant," he clarified. "You'd still be a prisoner, technically, but you'd be helping your fellow prisoners receive better care. And," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "and when this is all over, when you're released, having medical training and experience will help you rebuild your life." It was the first time anyone had spoken to Greta about the future, about life after the war, after the camps, after all of this. The first time someone had suggested that she might actually have a future worth rebuilding. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Yes, I would like that very much." As weeks passed, the dynamics in the camp continued to evolve. The women learned that many of the American soldiers were not professional military men, but draftees themselves, farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, shop clerks from New York. They had families back home, wives and sweethearts and mothers who wrote them letters. One young soldier named Private Davis showed Greta a photograph of his baby daughter, born just before he shipped overseas. "Haven't even held her yet," he said in his broken German. 2 years old now. Won't even know me." Greta found herself thinking about this, about how war had stolen from everyone, how it had made victims of people on all sides. The Americans had lost sons and brothers and fathers too. The German prisoners years away from home, fighting in foreign land, finally articulated mud what many of them were feeling. And yet, one evening, they had given tea. As the women sat on their cots after dinner, she said quietly, I think I understand now. Understand what? Frida asked. Why they treat us this way. Why they give us food and medicine and warmth. Ilse paused, her intelligent eyes thoughtful. They could have been cruel. After everything Germany did, after everything we did, they would have been justified in their cruelty. But they chose differently. Why, someone asked. Because, Ilse said slowly. They want to prove that they are different, that Americans are different, that democracy and freedom and human dignity are not just propaganda words, but real principles. They are showing us, showing the world, what they fight for. Greta thought about this long into the night. The war had been filled with propaganda on all sides, with declarations about superior races and manifest destiny and historical inevitability. But in the end, what had won was not the side with the most powerful ideology or the fiercest warriors. It was the side that remembered how to be kind. In late May, Captain Morrison called a general assembly in the camp's main hall. The women gathered nervously, uncertain what announcement might be coming. The war in Europe is over, the translator said, conveying Morrison's words. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. You are no longer prisoners of war, but displaced persons under Allied protection. A stunned silence filled the hall. Then, slowly, tentatively, someone began to cry. Then another. Then everyone. You will be processed for return to your homes. Morrison continued. Those whose homes have been destroyed or are in Soviet-controlled territory will be placed in displaced persons camps until arrangements can be made. The Red Cross will help you locate any surviving family members. Over the following weeks, the women were processed for release. Some had homes to return to. Many did not. Greta learned that Heidelberg was in the American zone of occupation, but her family's apartment building had been destroyed in the bombings. She had no idea if any relatives had survived. On the day of her release, she sought out Captain Morrison. Thank you, she said in careful English she had been practicing. For the warm milk. For everything. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. War makes monsters of everyone, Miss Zimmermann. Kindness is how we remember we're human. I hope you'll remember that, whatever comes next. I will, Greta promised. Always. Greta Zimmermann did rebuild her life. She completed her nursing training under the U.S. Army's educational programs for displaced persons, worked in a hospital in the American zone, and eventually immigrated to the United States in 1952. She married an American veteran named Robert Chen, who had served with the Medical Corps in Italy, and they raised 3 children in Queens, New York. She never forgot the warm milk. In her kitchen, even decades later, she would heat milk for her children when they were sick or sad or simply cold. She would press the warm mug into their hands and tell them, "This is how we show love. This is how we show that we see each other as human beings." Her daughter, Sarah, once asked her why she always insisted on warm milk, why it seemed so important to her. Greta told her the story, about the spring of 1945, about being a prisoner, about expecting cruelty and receiving kindness instead. They didn't have to treat us well, Greta explained. We were their enemies, but they chose to see us as human beings first. That one choice, that one act of simple kindness, changed everything for me. It gave me hope when I had none. It showed me that even in the darkest times, even between enemies, compassion is possible. And that's important? Sarah asked. That, Greta said, pressing a warm mug into her daughter's hands, is the most important thing of all. Never forget that the person across from you, even if they seem like your enemy, is human. Never forget that the smallest act of kindness can change a life. Mine was changed by warm milk and a captain who chose compassion over revenge. She lived to be 91 years old, Greta Zimmermann, and until her final days, she would heat milk for anyone who needed it. Her children, her grandchildren, neighbors, strangers at her door. She would press the warm cup into their hands and smile that soft, knowing smile of someone who understood the profound power of such a simple gesture. Because she had learned, in the cold spring of 1945, that kindness is not weakness. It is the strongest force in the world, strong enough to bridge the gap between enemies, strong enough to restore faith in humanity, strong enough to rebuild a shattered world. One warm cup at a time,